Today I'm going to take a look at this Inwin RF100 case, which is a 1U server case, and that's basically a review on it. It's actually a pretty nice case. It met all my requirements except one, but this video is also probably more to do with why you shouldn't buy 1U cases in a home lab. So it's kind of odd because it's a good case, but I don't think you should buy it. Probably. This is one of the few cases that you can find that are new and have front I/O. Well, technically this one is reversible, so you can actually have all of the I/O and the power supply at the back of the case, so the back of your rack, or at the front. Since this is going to be a router slash VM machine, I wanted all of the ports at the front because I have easy access to them to just plug them into my switch and all that kind of stuff. More aesthetic than anything else. I mean, you can just run the wires either way you need to, but I happen to like all the network cables coming out, and you can plug them right into your keystone panel and whatnot. And this is one of the few cases that have that. Other than a bunch of super micro cases, and I actually have a couple of them, and I just kind of ran into issues where I just, for whatever reason, I just couldn't get the hardware to fit. They're really designed for specific motherboards in the sense that, as we'll see on this case, the motherboard is actually kept so close to the chassis from the standoffs that you can't put many motherboards into it simply because there's no room for the back plate that's on the back of your motherboard socket to actually just fill that gap, and it just doesn't. It's ridiculous, so you can't use it. So I gave up on all the super micro boards. This one, combined with a specific cooler, which I'm going to show, allowed me to put a regular motherboard into this case, and it works. Is it as good as it should be? No, but it works. Now, one of the many oddities of 1U cases is that they do not have enough height to use a normal I/O shield. So sometimes they'll use like a half I/O shield, and some companies will actually include those with your motherboard. But those are very specific, and they don't allow for a lot of ports. For example, all of these ports that are high up would not work on that kind of design where you have to keep them all along the bottom. So they're usually simpler motherboards, usually with soldered on processors. What I did is just printed out a generic 1U I/O shield and just cut out everything that I needed. Normally this would go on the inside because of the little lip, so you'd push it through this way. I think it actually works a bit better like this, where you can just pop it on and off. That's more of a personal preference, doesn't really matter, doesn't affect anything. Taking a few minutes to just cut out everything, you know, it works. Getting into the hardware, power supply that came with it is made by Powerman, which I think is an offshoot of FSP. Power supply seemed great. It's 350 watt, has modern connectors. It was quiet, so I can't really complain about that. I just needed a different power supply in here, or I had a different one available. Other than that, this particular case will take MATX boards, but obviously because there's only one PCI Express slot, a horizontal one, you can only use one of the slots. So you're not getting your maximum of 4 slots, despite having the larger board, but you usually have more choice with MATX boards, so you can find ones that have more M.2 slots, that sort of thing. This particular motherboard is the Gigabyte Q670M D3H. And it's kind of a weird motherboard where it's like half like set up for embedded stuff, half set up for maybe industrial use, but it's not really an industrial board. It's still like a consumer board, but I don't know. It's kind of a weird middle ground because although it has a Q670 chipset, which is more of a business-oriented one that can do remote management, which is similar to IPMI, it also has things like COM ports and printer ports, of all things, like old parallel ports. This was the only motherboard that I could find that met my requirements, where it had 2 M.2 drives and 2 network interfaces, ideally one of which 2.5 gig, which this one is. This one's 1 gig. They're both Intel, although this is the older Intel 225 Mark V, which can have problems depending on the driver version and stuff. Intel's 2.5 gig NICs are kind of sketchy. The PCI Express card I'm using has dual Intel 226 controllers. They're newer. They supposedly fix more of the bugs, but they're still kind of iffy. Doesn't matter. I don't know. Motherboard takes DDR5 memory, and getting into one of the downsides of using kind of consumer boards with 1U cases is that they generally have their RAM in this orientation, which blocks your cooler. So this is a 1U cooler. It works well. It's loud though. And unlike most other coolers, you can't just swap out the fan and get a, like, swap it with a Noctua fan. This thing's just loud, and it's kind of hard to get it under control where it's not annoying. And that's one of the biggest problems, if not the biggest problem, with a 1U case, and why I say you probably don't want one. Unless you're putting all of your computer stuff in your garage or something, which is perfectly fine to do. Most people, I think, have their home lab stuff like in their office or whatever near their computer. And when you have a 1U case, you're limited to 40mm fans, and this case came with 2 of them. They are fine. They can PW on control and get fairly quiet. I just happen to have Noctua fans, so I just replaced them, and I even glued in an extra one just to stand here to just get some more airflow over the chipset and NIC. Not that they were getting particularly hot. Due to the design of this motherboard with the RAM here, even if you rotate this, the airflow is still not great because it's pulling, remember, it's reversed, so the airflow is front to back. It's very difficult to cool everything. Now this isn't even a very hot chip. This is an Intel 13500T, which is basically like a wattage limited 13th gen CPU, and it just kind of cooks itself. There's so little airflow, it kind of just traps the air in this section, because I also have a PCI Express riser here, which just traps the heat in this one little part. And again, this is a limitation of the design of the board, which most consumer boards are laid out like this, and the fact that it's a 1U case where you can't have a cooler that's higher to get the air flowing over all the RAM and everything. Initially, I bought a 2U case to put this in, and in fact, I filmed an entire video talking about the case and why I liked it so much. However, in the last kind of minute, I went, you know what? If I can get it down to 1U, I'll have enough space in my rack for something else, and blah, 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 blah. So I convinced myself to get one of these 1U cases. I thought I'll give it one more shot, because I've tried these before, and every time, you know, the 40mm fans either have to be super loud or you need like 30 of them, and you just can't get the cooling you need unless it's a really low power part. Gave it one more chance, and I regret it. No matter how many times I try and convince myself, I really just don't think 1U servers should be in a home lab situation. Again, unless you have a place to put this where you can keep it running at full tilt with like 10 fans in here, I just don't think you can get enough cooling in a 1U case where it's reasonable. That's not saying there's no place for 1U servers, plenty of them around. You know, obviously in a data center, they're used everywhere, and a lot of people use them at home, mostly because they either don't care about the noise or it's a really low power system that they've put into it. I just think if you're trying to use it for anything more than like an N100 CPU, you're just going to need so much cooling, and the airflow has so many issues when you're using consumer stuff that you just can't make it work. I just don't think it's really viable. Getting back to this particular case, it does have a 3.5-inch drive mount. This won't get much airflow. I'm not sure I'd really recommend using it. There's 2.5-inch bays over here. Those are perfectly fine. 2.5-inch drives generally don't get very hot. Looking at the back, which, mind you, normally is the front of the case when you're using it in a standard configuration, the I/O panel would be here. This grill, although, you know, nice looking, I would have preferred if they had designed it in a way that you could just fill this up with 40mm fans. If the openings in this, which are just designed for airflow, it'd be really nice if they had some screw holes lined up so you could just make a wall of fans. And honestly, you might be able to get away with it then, because then you can get enough static pressure even at low speeds, because they're sealing it all up, that you could probably get away with this. But the way it's currently set up, where you just have these like rather nice clip-in fan mounts that work well, you just don't get enough static pressure for these to really make that much of a difference. Unless you're running something that's extremely low power, you're just not going to get enough airflow out of this case where you can reliably keep it cool without it being super loud. This did come with included fans, 2 of them. They work perfectly well. They're louder than the Noctuas, but I'm sure they move more air. Overall, I do like this case. The only thing I'd really change on it is if they had changed this grill so that you could mount fans to it. You could even start closing it up with some cardboard or something to just get a reasonable number of fans in here. In order to use the PCI Express slot on this case, you need a 90-degree adapter. Now this particular case doesn't just take a 90-degree adapter. This is a 16x one. You can get shorter ones. But it also needs an extender, which, you know, these are both like $6 each, so it's not a big deal. But you need to join these together, and then you can use the main slot for your PCI Express card. Because of that extender, you can also just use the slot next to the main 16x slot. This particular one has a 1x slot right here, so you can use a 1x 90-degree adapter, so you don't need the little extender, but you're limited to whatever slot is here. I think one of the biggest issues with at least the 1U cases that I have, I personally haven't seen one with higher standoffs. You just don't have enough height in a 1U chassis to raise the motherboard up much. So when this motherboard is in here, I have all the screws taken out. It's actually resting on the back plate for the LGA 1700 socket. That's not good, because that means in order to screw it down, it has to flex the board. Now you can see there's a little bit of flex over here, but over here, it's actually causing the whole board to move when I push down. And that's because the standoffs are lower than this part. You're bending everything down around this high point. And that's with a very specific cooler that I had to track down that has the correct mounting hardware. Now, most coolers, the mounting bracket is actually a very large piece that goes over this back plate, and that makes it even higher, so high that it damaged the motherboard if you were to screw it down completely. This particular cooler that I found, there's also a 2U version that also has the same mounting system, but it's not really important because 2U has enough space. This mounting system allows it to go beside the back plate without adding any height. You kind of have to look at all the pictures, and not every cooler has pictures of its mounting hardware. So when you're trying to figure out, hey, will this thing work in my case? I basically had to buy several 1U coolers and just hope that they had the right back plate. I even tried one that has push down pins similar to the stock cooler, or these heatsink pins, and it didn't work. The pegs came out too far. You're limited in your cooler. They're often loud. Many of them, like, I don't even know how you're supposed to mount it in a 1U case if they make them that like it literally doubles the height of this. So I don't know what kind of 1U case has that much height on the standoffs. I was kind of lucky to find this one, and it does technically work. What I was doing is I screwed it in and just didn't clamp it down a lot. Like, I just screwed them in most of the way, and that was fine. But I think this, along with the noise, is a serious limitation of 1U cases when you're dealing with like consumer hardware that they expect you to put in. You know, they say on these cases it takes ITX and ATX motherboards. It doesn't say, oh, it needs to be a specific server board that has a thin backplate or anything like that. I really don't like these cases, and I think I'm finally officially done with them. That being said, I will probably continue to buy weird 1U appliances because I always find those interesting. They always have some kind of weird design or just like funky case or whatever. When it comes to building your own system in a 1U case, I don't think I can recommend it. And I'm personally just going to stick with 2U cases from now on.